What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today, I just wanted to take just a little bit to respond to one of the videos that Cameron, over on Capturing Christianity has put out recently. And, initially it was titled something completely different, like, historian destroys Jesus mythicism or something like that. But basically you have Gary Habermas who says a bunch of dumb shit in an interview. Like this.
And as Bart Ehrman says, he knows of nobody, no accredited specialist in the field of religion, no matter how liberal or how atheist or whatever, none of them who will have university, college, or seminary positions, none of them teach that Jesus never lived. The guys who teach it and claim to be scholars are people who don't have accredited degrees, he said, with two exceptions.
So we're going to go through this short little clip today, and if you're interested in Jesus mythicism or the history of Christianity in general, then please stay tuned.
So what is, in your mind, the fastest way to disarm a mythicist?
Okay, so I would like to note the current title of this particular video, and that's Undeniable Historical Evidence for the Existence of Jesus. And they legit do not actually give us any kind of evidence in this video. Of course, Cameron right here at the beginning is saying, hey, what's the quickest way to, like, shut down Jesus mythicism in a discussion? And to be quite honest, unless you're having the discussion of, like, historicity of Jesus in general, you don't even have to cover the historicity of Jesus if you're discussing the historicity of the Gospels or the Bible in general. I would not suggest anybody actually going that route in a discussion. Only applicable discussion that there is to be had around this is specifically on this topic. But what hopefully Gary Habermas is going to give us here is the quickest way to shut down Jesus mythicism. Not that there's undeniable historical evidence that he's going to present or anything like that.
I've got a book called Historical Jesus where I list 12.5 texts, many of them outside the New Testament, in the ancient world for the existence of Jesus.
Sorry to stop this so quick again, but I've reviewed all of these historical sources that most apologists will give you. And I've got several videos. I'll probably have some listed in the description here. I've got a card popping up where we cover them. But all in all, what these sources do is they just relay what the Christians believe to have happened and not what actually happened. There's technically only one source that Christians can really appeal to, and that would be Paul. Paul is our earliest source, but even then, Paul doesn't really solidify Jesus here on earth. So I'm kind of interested in where Gary goes with this. Like I said before, he's not actually presenting any kind of evidence. All he's using is rhetoric in order to squash the very idea that we should question his historicity, which is kind of odd for historical studies. I mean, it's a good thing to question whether or not things we consider to be historical actually are historical.
But one probably better example I would use, some say, yeah, but you're a Christian. Okay, Bart Ehrman, an atheist New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years.
And see, the problem here is that I don't know if Bart Ehrman actually lists or where he would have gotten this information that Bart Ehrman lists, like, independent sources. I think that Bart Ehrman considers the four, Gospels to be independent sources, but all of those Gospels actually derive off of each other. So regardless of whether Habermas here is actually correct in what Bart cites, which I have no reason to doubt that Bart would cite these things. The fact is that these independent sources really aren't all that independent. Just take the Gospels for existence. All of those depend on Mark. Mark is the first Gospel, and people went through and redacted Mark. You don't really have an independent Gospel, where it's not independent of, like, Christian beliefs or anything like that. All of these sources, all of them, all they do is just report what Christians believe to have happened at that time, mostly in the 2nd century.
Now, 100 years is actually kind of strict, but it's a nice, narrow parameter for saying Jesus lived. 100, and here's an atheist, 100 years' time, 15 different sources evidencing Jesus' death. If he died, he had to have lived.
Well, but again, there's not 15 independent sources that attest to him being alive. That's not a thing. I'm sure that Bart Ehrman considers Josephus to be like an independent account, but that's been pretty thoroughly debunked as being a forgery. Most people consider the second reference in Josephus to also be a historical account of Jesus, but for me, that just doesn't make any kind of sense with the way that it's written and the fact that it mentions Jesus ben Damnius later on in the passage. So it seems like an interpolation. I'm not saying the entire part is an interpolation. I just think the part that identifies Jesus as being the Christ, or the one called Christ, as being an interpolation. There's a lot of scholarly support for that position, but I digress. I do agree here with his assessment that within 100 years of the supposed lifespan of Jesus, I think that we should see like historical accounts of him existing. I mean, we've got Paul that was writing just 20 years after he supposedly died. You would figure that Paul would be our best source for having some kind of earthly physical Jesus, but we just don't have that. What we have is Paul recounting revelations that he's had and also his personal interpretation of the scripture, which just so happens to match the other apostles that were going around at the time. An apostle doesn't mean eyewitness. An apostle means that they got revelation directly from Jesus and they read the scripture and got revelation and information about Jesus through there. That's all that means. Paul never mentions eyewitnesses or anything like that.
So Bart Ehrman calls that one of the two best evidences we have for that Jesus lived in history. The other one is that Paul is the best New Testament reference we have. Critics talk about half of Paul's epistles, 7 out of 13, being accredited, and you can use them in arguing because they're great sources.
All right. Yes, Gary, I agree with this point. Paul is the best source in the New Testament for a supposed historical Jesus. Again, like I've laid out before, Paul doesn't ever reference eyewitnesses, and he doesn't reference a physical Jesus here on earth. He doesn't reference any of Jesus's miracles or his ministry or anything like that. He doesn't even mention disciples.
Well, the best thing Paul gives us is that he was an eyewitness to the eyewitnesses.
No, that is not what Paul gives us. Like I said before, Paul never identifies anybody as an eyewitness. But you see, here's the problem, is that apologists like Gary Habermas, what they do is they take the fact that the Gospels are written for us now, and they try to use that information in context with Paul. But that's really taking some sources and placing them out of time. Because at Paul's point in time, no Gospels were written. There was no kind of actual New Testament. Paul was starting it all, right? So at that point, there's no way that you can use the Gospels to ascertain what Paul would have known about Jesus' ministry or who the disciples were or anything like that. Some people mention the part in the Pauline Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 10, I think it is mentioning the 12, but it's very ambiguous there as to what the 12 actually means. Could it mean some kind of 12 tribes of Israel? The 12 reference is very ambiguous. Also, it doesn't make sense that, if the Gospels relay some kind of true information about, who the disciples were and all of this, because with Paul referencing the 12, I mean, even in the Gospels, they number themselves 11 after Jesus dies because Judas, kills himself. It doesn't make a lot of sense here for that to directly reference the disciples. And anybody that reads it as mentioning, directly the disciples is reading information into it. They're using historical sources from later on in the timeline and applying it to a point in time where they're just not applicable.
Paul in Galatians 1 and again in Galatians 2, he went to Jerusalem and got to know Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, then in Galatians 2, John. They're all together, and the topic they're discussing, as Paul tells us, is the nature of the gospel, to make sure they're all on the same page. And Paul concludes, yes, they're all on the same page.
yes, that actually did happen. And it wasn't James, the brother of Jesus. It's actually the brother of the Lord. And that's very specific because it's a cultic title at that time. Paul's particular doctrine has this idea of being brothers and sisters in the Lord. You can see it elsewhere in Galatians where he's talking about being able to bring a wife along and he calls her a sister. So unless you're suggesting that these sisters were literally sisters, there's no way to determine when he's talking about this cultic kind of brother, this faith-based brother, or when he's talking about a blood brother. Now, there is a way that he could have denoted it by either saying the brother of Jesus or brother of the Lord in the flesh. That would have been another way to denote that, you know, they were blood or kin, like blood kin or whatever. That would have been a way. As it stands, it's ambiguous, and I don't really think that it helps either side. Like, I don't think that it helps mythicism at all, that particular part, the whole brother of the Lord thing, and I don't think that it helps the historicity side. I will say that it is probably the best evidence that you could get for a historical Jesus because of how ambiguous Paul actually is about that particular section, but I really don't think that that is directly referencing a blood brother, considering Paul's doctrine on what it means to be a brother or sister in the Lord. But he does talk to all those people to confirm the Bible, or not the Bible, but the gospel that he is teaching. I mean, that does actually happen. Paul never denotes these people as being eyewitnesses or even disciples. He only identifies them as apostles, just like him, because he got revelation from Jesus and revelation from Scripture. He read Scripture and it was revealed to him through Scripture is what I mean. Given that Paul never actually mentions eyewitnesses or anything like that, it's very dubious here with Gary saying that Paul confirmed with eyewitnesses and that he was a eyewitness of eyewitnesses. Like, that's ridiculous. It would be great if we had an eyewitness to the eyewitnesses. That would be fantastic. I would totally throw away mythicism right now. I would do it, but that's not what we have in evidence.
But here, that's two great sets of data for the existence of Jesus. 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus.
Except we don't have 15 sources of crucifixion. They claim that there's 15 sources for Jesus and his death and everything like that, but I mean, that's not really what we have. Again, I've already mentioned this earlier, but like I said, there's no direct evidence that Jesus was crucified.
And Paul, knowing himself, of course, Peter, James, and John, the big four, he knows all of them. And he can ask him whatever questions he wants to about what Jesus looked like when he was walking and talking in Galilee. So it would be like asking George Washington or asking Thomas Jefferson, what was George like? Asking Adams and John Quincy Adams and Monroe and so on, what do you know about George? And then it'd be really cool if you could talk to Martha. And that's neat because we have the women's testimony for going to the tomb and so on. So you make a multifaceted case for George Washington being the first president of the United States. We can do the same thing with Jesus actually having existed.
Well, no, but we can't, at least not in the way that you compared it to George Washington, because we don't have people that actually knew him. It's later attested that Cephas and James the Just and John and all those guys actually knew Jesus, but that's not what we actually have in evidence, because what we have in evidence is Paul, and he never denotes them as eyewitnesses, so it just really seems like you're reading information into the text at this point. That's not an honest way to go about this particular subject. It's very dishonest of you there, Gary.
And as Bart Ehrman says, he knows of nobody, no accredited specialist in the field of religion, no matter how liberal, how atheist or whatever, none of them who will have university, college, or seminary positions, none of them teach that Jesus never lived.
Well, I wouldn't expect them to teach that Jesus never lived. I don't know why this is a criteria. It's a very peculiar one because it seems to be like a bandwagon fallacy as well as a bullseye fallacy, because basically what you're doing is you're taking your pool of people that you have subjectively deemed as having credible enough accreditations to be able to comment on this particular thing, and you're saying, you're drawing a bullseye around it and be like, see, all of these people right here say that Jesus existed, therefore Jesus existed. I mean, it's a bandwagon fallacy here. I mean, at several points in history, you had multitudes of people believing ridiculous things that we know are false now. Just like, for instance, I'm fairly certain that Gary Habermas believes that Noah, Moses, Abraham, all of them people actually existed in history and the Exodus actually happened. But as we know now through archaeological finds and, examining the text, that's not actually true. And it didn't overturn overnight. The initial consensus of that particular thing was that Noah and Moses and all that actually existed, and the Bible was the best historical evidence to know what happened with the early Israelites. That was the initial consensus, and then through time and archaeological finds and then textual criticism of the Septuagint or the Hebrew Bible, whatever, through all of that, it eventually overturned and changed, and now the consensus is that they didn't exist and that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written documentary style. We've come a long way in historical studies, and just because something's not a consensus now doesn't mean that it's wrong. So I really feel like it's very short-sighted of him, and he's just hiding behind his shield of this bandwagon fallacy because everybody already agrees on it. I don't care if everybody all agrees on it. I want to know what the evidence is, just like with climate change. I wanted to know what the actual evidence was and whether or not it actually supports the conclusions of the scientists. That's not to mean that I'm an expert or anything like that, but I can read these studies and I can interpret it myself to draw conclusions from it.
The guys who teach it and claim to be scholars are people who don't have accredited degrees. He said with 2 exceptions.
Actually, there's more than just 3 people. I've actually got a whole list that's in my Crestus app. If you guys don't know about it, links are down in the description. But there's also Hector Avalos, Thomas Brody, Richard Carrier, Arthur Droge, Raphael Lataster, Kurt Knoll, Robert Price, Thomas L. Thompson. All of these people are on at least on the agnostic side of things, like that we should be questioning whether or not Jesus existed. So painting mythicism or the conversation around whether or not Jesus existed as being this very minority thing and that only, a small amount of people, think, at least in his very selected criteria of people that can have an opinion on it, to paint it as that is just disingenuous.
Is Bart's count. The rest do not have accredited degrees and none of them have university positions.
Why does that matter? If they have a university position or not. I don't understand this. Why does it matter that they're teaching at a school? I mean, I have friends that are, that have these kind of high-ranking degrees that don't teach at a school. So why should it matter whether or not they teach at a school? See, this is just a way for them to sort of drown out the minority voice in this particular conversation, because they're like, oh, well, nobody at a teaching university, nobody that's teaching today is actually teaching that Jesus never existed or thinks that Jesus never existed. Oh, okay. Why does it matter whether or not they're teaching anything? As long as they have degrees in these fields from accredited institutions, I don't see why it really matters. But of course, this is coming from Gary Habermas, who teaches at Liberty University, which, I mean, it's accredited, but I don't know how.
Why are they making such a big splash, do you think?
Probably because they infiltrate almost every website there is and have a bunch of, they have a loud presence. And people say, whoa. And when they say, oh no, and they pretend like they're scholars, but they don't have any training, they haven't been in the field, and all the other scholars, atheists even like Bart Ehrman, say they're wrong.
Again, I don't give a shit what Bart Ehrman thinks. I don't care what the consensus is. I care about the actual evidence. That's all. I don't understand why you hide behind this bandwagon. I mean, I guess I get why, because it's really the only shield that you have. But writing us off as just some kind of internet fad, or the fact that, the minority voice is speaking out more and more and more, I really don't see how that's an argument for or against anything. I mean, right now there are currently 2 books that are published that thoroughly look at, like peer-reviewed books, that thoroughly look at the question of whether or not Jesus existed. That would be Raphael Lataster's most recent book, which is actually aimed at like libraries and universities and stuff. And then there's Richard Carrier's book. So, I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are having this conversation, and it's a worthwhile conversation to have. I mean, Raphael Lataster is an agnostic on whether or not Jesus existed. He doesn't know if he did or if he didn't. That's perfectly fine. I think that that's probably the best position that you can take if you're not going to dive deep into the actual topic. He wants to act like it's just some passing thing that's just not up for discussion. It totally is up for discussion.
So to me, that's the real test. It's not just Christians saying they're wrong. It's non-Christian scholars saying they don't have a chance.
Well, okay, so true, it's not just Christians that are agreeing that Jesus existed in history, but you also have to understand that with this minority view, we're fighting against a lot of already established misinformation. Misinformation that people see as information. So it's going to take a lot in order to convince people that they're wrong about something. And, I mean, I have known people to swing extremely one way and then swing extremely back the other way. But regardless, I do think that this conversation needs to be had. I do think that this conversation is important, and I think that people need to look into the actual evidence. That's why I do my videos here about mythicism. That's why I've been going at mythicism so hard here lately, because it's something that I'm passionate about, and it's a conversation that I think is worth having, and it's an area that has yet to be explored. So I'm very interested in having these conversations, but people like Gary Habermas just want to shut down the conversation. And to me, that's very telling, because it makes it seem like, oh, well, you shouldn't talk about that. It's like, oh, I shouldn't, should I? That just makes me want to talk about it even more. It's the whole red button thing. Don't tell me not to push the red button, because I'm going to be curious as to what the fuck that button does. Anyways, heathens, I'm going to have, an extensive review of the Gary Habermas interview. He talks a lot about NDEs and the Shroud of Turin. He says a fucking ton about the Shroud of Turin stuff. So, if you're interested in that, then I hope that you guys will subscribe to the channel here so you can get updated on these videos. If you will, go down below, leave me a comment, and make sure you smash that like button. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.